Marcus Webb's heart stopped beating in the barn just 3 days after he'd gambled his last $200 on the massive wild horse that everyone warned would kill him. Now that same 18-hand animal stood over his dying body, and what happened next defied everything anyone thought they knew about broken things. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The November wind cut through the thin jacket of Marcus Webb as he stood at the edge of the livestock auction yard, his weathered hands gripping the wooden fence with a force that made his knuckles turn white. At 48 years old, Marcus looked older than his years. The lines etched deep into his face told stories he rarely spoke aloud, stories of distant lands and battles that had taken more from him than just the full use of his left leg. The limp was obvious to anyone who watched him walk, but it was the invisible wounds that hurt the most, the ones that kept him awake at night and made crowds feel suffocating. He had come to the auction with no real intention of buying anything. The truth was, Marcus barely had enough money to get through the winter. His small disability check covered rent on the rundown trailer he called home and little else. But something had drawn him here today. Perhaps the same restlessness that had plagued him since returning from overseas 5 years ago. The auction yard was familiar territory from his childhood, back when his father used to bring him to watch the horses and cattle sell. Back then, life had seemed simpler, full of possibility. Now everything felt impossibly complicated. The auctioneer's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing lot numbers and prices in that rapid-fire cadence that Marcus remembered from decades ago. He watched as horses were led through the ring, most of them well-groomed and manageable, their handlers displaying them with practiced ease. Buyers nodded and raised their numbers, and the animals sold quickly to ranchers and horse traders. Marcus felt a pang of something like envy. These people had purpose. They had the means to care for these animals, to give them homes and work. He had nothing to offer anyone, not even himself. Then everything changed. The massive gate at the far end of the ring swung open and a commotion erupted. 3 handlers struggled with a horse unlike any Marcus had seen before. The animal was enormous, standing at least 18 hands high, with a coat that appeared to be a silvery gray in the harsh auction lights. But it was the horse's behavior that commanded attention. The creature pulled against the ropes, rearing and striking out with hooves the size of dinner plates. Its eyes rolled wild and white-rimmed, and foam flecked its muzzle as it fought against every attempt to control it. The auctioneer's voice took on a different tone, one of barely concealed frustration. This horse, he explained, had been seized from a property where it had been neglected for years. The previous owner had kept it isolated in a small pen, never handling it properly, never training it. The horse had grown massive and feral, too dangerous for most people to consider. The animal had been through 3 auctions already, and nobody wanted to take on the challenge. The starting bid was set remarkably low, almost insulting for such a magnificent animal. But the auctioneer seemed resigned to the fact that this horse would likely end up at a slaughter facility if someone didn't claim it today. Marcus found himself moving closer to the ring, his bad leg forgotten as he pressed against the rail. Something about the horse's eyes caught him. Beneath the fear and rage, he saw something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or maybe it was just his imagination, but he could swear the horse was looking directly at him, as if pleading for understanding. The handlers were rough with the animal, yanking on the ropes and shouting, which only made the horse more frantic. Marcus winced with each harsh movement. He knew what it felt like to be mishandled, to be seen as broken and dangerous rather than hurt and afraid. The bidding opened, and silence filled the arena. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no numbers went up. The auctioneer lowered the price once, then twice, still nothing. Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest. He thought about his bank account, the meager savings he had left after paying this month's bills. He thought about the impossibility of caring for a horse this size, especially one with serious behavioral issues. He thought about his small property with its ramshackle barn that leaked in 3 places. He thought about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But then he looked at the horse again, really looked at it, and saw himself reflected in those terrified eyes. He saw the trauma, the isolation, the way the world had given up on this creature, just as it had given up on him. The horse wasn't vicious or mean. It was scared and alone, fighting because it was the only thing it knew how to do anymore. Marcus understood that feeling better than anyone. He had spent years fighting invisible enemies in his own mind, lashing out at people who tried to help because trust had become impossible. The auctioneer was about to close the bidding and send the horse away when Marcus raised his hand. His voice cracked as he called out a bid, barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Heads turned to look at him. Some people laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others shook their heads in pity. The auctioneer paused, surprised, then repeated the bid with renewed energy. He called for any other offers, going through the motions, but everyone could see that no one else was interested in this problem animal. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Marcus's chest. The horse was his. As the reality of what he had just done settled over him, Marcus felt a strange mixture of terror and something he had not experienced in a very long time. It took him a moment to recognize the feeling. It was hope. The paperwork seemed to take forever. Marcus sat in the cramped auction office, his hands trembling slightly as he signed document after document. The woman behind the desk kept glancing at him with a mixture of concern and confusion, as if she wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but professional courtesy kept her silent. When she finally slid the bill of sale across the counter, Marcus stared at the total. It was every dollar he had left in his savings account, plus another $40 he would have to pull from the emergency cash he kept hidden in his trailer. There would be no money for groceries this week, no money for anything except finding a way to get this horse home. Outside, the chaos was already beginning. Marcus limped toward the holding pens behind the auction building, following the sounds of shouting and the thunderous impacts of hooves against metal. When he rounded the corner, his stomach dropped. The handlers had managed to get the horse into a small pen, but the animal was destroying everything around it. Metal panels buckled under the force of powerful kicks. The horse screamed, a sound Marcus had never heard from an animal before, raw and primal and filled with absolute terror. 3 men stood at a distance, looking helpless and angry. One of them, a burly man with a red face and sweat-stained hat, spotted Marcus and marched over. "You the fool who bought this nightmare?" he asked, though it was more accusation than question. Marcus nodded, unable to find his voice. The man shook his head in disgust. "Well, you got yourself a real problem, mister. This animal is dangerous. We can't even get close enough to put a lead on it. You got a trailer?" Marcus felt his face flush. He had not thought that far ahead. In his impulsive moment of connection with the horse, he had not considered the practical realities of transporting an 18-hand wild animal that trusted no one. "No," he admitted quietly, "I don't have a trailer." The man cursed under his breath and spat into the dirt. "Course you don't. Look, we close in an hour. You need to figure something out fast because we're not keeping this thing here overnight. It's already damaged 2 panels. You're going to be charged for that, by the way." Marcus felt panic rising in his chest, the old familiar tightness that signaled the beginning of an anxiety attack. He forced himself to breathe slowly, using the techniques his VA therapist had taught him. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The world steadied slightly. "Think," Marcus told himself. There had to be a solution. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his limited contacts. Most of the people he had known before the war had drifted away during his deployment or in the difficult years after. He had burned bridges with others during his worst periods of anger and isolation. But there was one name, one person who might still be willing to help. Danny Garcia had served in the same unit, had been there during some of the worst firefights. Danny had also made it home in one piece, at least physically, and had managed to rebuild his life better than Marcus had. They had not spoken in months, but Marcus had no other options. The phone rang 4 times before Danny answered. Marcus explained the situation in halting sentences, aware of how insane it all sounded. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Man," Danny finally said, "you really know how to get yourself into situations, don't you?" But there was no judgment in his voice, only a tired sort of amusement. "Look, I got a stock trailer. I can be there in about 90 minutes, but you owe me an explanation for this." Marcus felt relief wash over him. "Thank you," he said simply, meaning it more than Danny could know. While he waited, Marcus approached the pen slowly. The handlers had given up and retreated to the office, probably to calculate how much they could charge him for damages. The horse stood in the center of the small enclosure, sides heaving, sweat darkening its gray coat. Up close, Marcus could see the full extent of the animal's condition. Ribs showed beneath the skin, not emaciated but definitely underfed for a horse of this size. The hooves were overgrown, cracked and uneven. Old scars crisscrossed the legs, evidence of years spent in inadequate fencing. But it was the eyes that held Marcus transfixed. Even now, wild with fear, there was an intelligence there, a soul that had been damaged but not destroyed. "Hey there," Marcus said softly, keeping his distance from the fence. "I know you're scared. I know you think everyone is your enemy." The horse's ears flicked toward him, the only acknowledgement of his presence. Marcus continued talking, keeping his voice low and steady. "I don't blame you for being angry. World's been pretty cruel to you, hasn't it? Same here, friend. Same here." He did not expect the horse to understand his words, but something about speaking aloud helped calm his own racing thoughts. For 15 minutes, he stood there talking about nothing and everything, about his own fear, his own struggles, the way some days it felt impossible to keep going. The horse gradually stopped moving, though its muscles remained tense and ready to explode into action at any moment. When Danny arrived, he took one look at the horse and let out a low whistle. "Jesus, Marcus, that thing is massive. How are we supposed to load it?" Marcus had been wondering the same thing. The trailer Danny had brought was solid and well built, but getting the horse inside would require actually touching the animal, putting a lead on it, guiding it up the ramp. None of that seemed remotely possible given the horse's current state. "We'll figure it out," Marcus said with more confidence than he felt. Danny backed the trailer up to the pen gate while Marcus stood watching the horse's every movement. The animal had retreated to the far corner, its massive body pressed against the fence panels, eyes fixed on the 2 men with a mixture of suspicion and fear. Every muscle in its body was coiled tight, ready to explode into violence at the slightest provocation. Marcus could see the whites of its eyes, the flared nostrils, the way its ears pinned flat against its skull. This was an animal that had learned the hard way that humans meant pain and confinement. One of the auction workers appeared, a younger guy Marcus had not seen before. He carried a long pole with a loop of rope at the end. "Gonna need to catch it somehow," the worker said matter-of-factly, as if discussing a routine task. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Something about the casual way the man held that pole, the way he approached the pen as if the horse were nothing more than livestock to be processed, made anger flare in Marcus's chest. "No," he said firmly. "We're not using that." The worker stopped, confused. "How else you planning to catch it?" he asked with obvious skepticism in his voice. Marcus did not have an answer, not a practical one anyway. He only knew that lassoing this traumatized animal would make everything worse. The horse needed trust, not more force. But trust took time, and they did not have time. The auction yard was closing. Danny stood beside the trailer, arms crossed, watching the standoff with concern etched across his face. Marcus could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of impossible expectations. His bad leg ached from standing too long, and his head was starting to pound with the familiar tension that preceded his worst episodes. "Just give me a minute," Marcus said to no one in particular. He approached the pen slowly, each step measured and deliberate despite his limp. The horse tracked his movement, body tensing further if that was even possible. Marcus stopped at the gate, his hand resting on the cold metal. He could feel the vibration of the horse's heavy breathing through the fence panels. For a long moment, he just stood there, not speaking, not moving, just existing in the same space as this terrified creature. He thought about all the times he had felt cornered, all the moments when well-meaning people had tried to force him into situations before he was ready. He thought about the therapists who pushed too hard, the friends who could not understand why he could not just get over it, the system that treated him like a problem to be solved rather than a person who needed patience. "I know what they did to you," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you've got no reason to trust anyone. And I'm not going to lie to you. We have to get you out of here. But I promise you this, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to force you if there's any other way." The horse's ears flickered forward slightly, the first sign that it was actually listening rather than just monitoring for threats. Marcus continued talking, keeping his voice soft and steady. "See that trailer behind me? That's going to take you away from this place. I've got a small property, nothing fancy. The barn's pretty rough, but it's got 4 walls and a roof. There's pasture, not much, but enough for you to move around. And there won't be any crowds, any shouting, any rough handling. Just you and me trying to figure this out together." Danny watched from beside the trailer, not interrupting, though Marcus could feel his friend's anxiety about the situation. The sun was sinking lower in the sky and the temperature was dropping. They needed to move soon or risk traveling in the dark on rural roads with a panicked animal in tow. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had that might help, a crushed granola bar he had forgotten about until now. It was not much, certainly not proper horse feed, but it was something. He unwrapped it slowly, the crinkling paper making the horse's ears swivel toward the sound. The auction worker who had brought the catchpole was still standing nearby, watching the scene with obvious impatience. "You're wasting time," he called out. "That thing's not going to come to you for a snack." Marcus ignored him, breaking off a piece of the granola bar and holding it flat on his palm, extending his arm through the fence rails. The horse snorted, a sharp explosive sound, and took 2 steps back. Marcus did not move, did not pull his hand away. He just waited, arm extended, offering what little he had. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an hour. The worker muttered something about crazy people and walked away, shaking his head. Then, something shifted. The horse took one tentative step forward, then another. Its neck stretched out, nostrils flaring as it tested the air, trying to catch the scent of what Marcus held. The movement was painfully slow, as if the animal was fighting every instinct that screamed at it to keep its distance. Marcus held his breath, afraid that any sudden movement would break whatever fragile thread of curiosity was pulling the horse closer. The gray muzzle inched nearer, whiskers twitching until finally, with a speed that startled Marcus, the horse snatched the piece of granola bar from his palm and retreated several steps to eat it. It was not trust, not by a long shot, but it was a beginning. Marcus broke off another piece and held it out, this time not quite as far through the fence. The horse approached more quickly this time, emboldened by the first success. The process of coaxing the horse closer took another 20 minutes, each piece of granola bar bringing the animal incrementally nearer to the gate where Marcus stood. Danny had moved to open the pen gate and position it so that it created a chute leading directly to the trailer ramp, narrowing the horse's options and making a straight path the most logical choice. It was clever thinking, the kind of practical problem-solving that had kept them both alive overseas. Marcus was grateful for his friend's patience and ingenuity, knowing that most people would have given up by now or resorted to forceful methods. When the last piece of granola bar was gone, Marcus faced a critical moment. He needed to open the gate and somehow convince this massive, frightened animal to walk past him and into the trailer. His heart hammered against his ribs as he slowly unlatched the gate, the metallic click sounding impossibly loud in the evening quiet. The horse's head shot up, ears pinned back again, body tensing for flight or fight. Marcus kept talking, his voice a constant stream of soft reassurance, even though his mouth had gone dry with fear. "Easy now," he murmured. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just going to walk out of here together. Nice and slow." He pulled the gate open just wide enough to create the chute Danny had envisioned, then stepped to the side, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. For a long moment, nothing happened. The horse stood frozen, eyeing the opening with deep suspicion. Marcus could see its mind working, weighing options, calculating risks. The animal was smart. That much was obvious. It understood that this opening represented change, and change had never been good in its experience. But staying in this small pen was not an option either, not with the pressure of human presence surrounding it. The decision came suddenly. The horse bolted forward, an explosion of muscle and momentum that sent Marcus stumbling backward despite his effort to stay calm. The massive animal thundered through the opening, hooves striking sparks off the concrete. For a terrible second, Marcus thought it would veer away from the trailer, would crash through the makeshift barriers Danny had created and disappear into the darkening evening. But something, instinct or luck or desperation, drove the horse straight up the ramp and into the trailer. The entire structure shook with the impact of its weight. Danny moved with impressive speed, slamming the trailer gate shut and securing the latches before the horse could reverse course. Inside the trailer, the animal went berserk. The sound was terrifying, a combination of screaming whinnies and the thunderous boom of hooves against metal walls. The trailer rocked on its wheels, and Marcus feared for a moment that the horse might actually break through or tip the entire thing over. Danny looked at him with wide eyes, the same expression he had worn during rocket attacks in Afghanistan, a mixture of adrenaline and barely controlled fear. "We need to move now," Danny said urgently, while it's still contained. Marcus nodded, his legs feeling weak as he limped toward Danny's truck. The drive back to Marcus's property was the longest 45 minutes of his life. Every bump in the road, every turn, brought renewed chaos from the trailer. The horse thrashed and kicked, the sounds carrying clearly through the cab of the truck, despite the engine noise. Marcus sat rigid in the passenger seat, hands clenched into fists, silently praying that they would make it home without the animal injuring itself seriously or breaking free. Danny drove with careful precision, taking turns slowly and avoiding potholes when possible, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror to monitor the trailer's movement. "What are you going to call it?" Danny asked, probably trying to distract them both from the violence happening behind them. Marcus had not thought about names. He had barely thought beyond the moment of buying the horse, acting on pure impulse and emotion rather than any kind of plan. But now, with the question hanging in the air, he considered it. The horse was gray, nearly white in certain light, and wild as a storm. "Thunder," he said after a moment. "I'll call him Thunder." Danny nodded slowly, a slight smile crossing his face despite their tense situation. "Fits him," he agreed. "Definitely fits him." When they finally turned onto the long gravel driveway leading to Marcus's property, darkness had fully settled. The headlights illuminated the rundown barn, the peeling paint and sagging roof line suddenly looking even more inadequate than usual. Marcus felt a wave of doubt crash over him. What was he doing? How could he possibly think he was equipped to handle an animal like Thunder? He could barely handle his own life, barely manage to get through each day without falling into the dark spirals of depression and anxiety that had plagued him since coming home from war. And now he had taken responsibility for a living creature that was just as damaged and dangerous as he felt himself to be. But there was no turning back now. Danny backed the trailer up to the barn entrance, positioning it so that when they opened the gate, Thunder would have a direct path into the largest stall. Marcus had hastily prepared it before leaving for the auction that morning, in a moment of optimism he now recognized as naive. Fresh straw covered the floor, and he had filled a water trough and hung a hay net, though he had no idea if Thunder would touch any of it. The stall was bigger than the pen at the auction yard, but still confining for such a large animal. It would have to do for now, at least until they could assess the situation in daylight. They positioned themselves on either side of the trailer gate, ready to swing it open, and then get out of the way fast. Marcus's hands shook as he gripped the latch. He could hear Thunder inside, still agitated but somewhat quieter now, as if the animal was conserving energy or simply exhausted from the battle. On the count of 3, Marcus whispered to Danny. His friend nodded, muscles tensed and ready. 1, 2, 3. They yanked the gate open and immediately pressed themselves against the barn walls, creating as much space as possible for the horse to exit. For a moment, nothing happened. The trailer ramp was down, the path clear, but Thunder did not move. Marcus could see the horse's silhouette in the darkness of the trailer, a massive shadow that seemed to fill every inch of the space. Then, slowly, Thunder began to back down the ramp, hooves clanging against the metal in a hesitant rhythm. The horse emerged into the dim light cast by the single bare bulb hanging in the barn, and Marcus got his first real look at what he had bought. Thunder was even more magnificent than he had appeared at the auction. Despite the poor condition and obvious neglect, there was something majestic about the animal. The gray coat seemed to shimmer in the weak light, and the sheer size of the horse was breathtaking. But it was the wariness in those dark eyes that struck Marcus most deeply. Thunder stood at the base of the ramp, head high, nostrils flaring, taking in every detail of this new environment. The horse was calculating, measuring threats, looking for escape routes. It was behavior Marcus recognized because he did the same thing every time he entered a new space, always noting the exits, always preparing for the worst. Thunder suddenly bolted sideways, away from the open stall door that Marcus had intended him to enter. The horse's shoulder slammed into a support beam with enough force to make the entire barn structure shudder. Danny cursed and jumped back, though he was already well out of range. Thunder spun in a tight circle, wild-eyed, searching for a way out of this new trap. Marcus felt his chest tighten with panic, not for his own safety but for the horse. If Thunder kept crashing around like this in the confined space of the barn, he could seriously injure himself or bring the whole rickety structure down on top of them. "Easy, Thunder," Marcus called out, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Easy, boy, nobody's going to hurt you here." But Thunder was beyond listening, lost in his own terror. The horse reared, front hooves pawing the air dangerously close to the low ceiling beams. When he came down, one hoof caught the edge of the water trough, sending it flying and flooding the barn floor with icy water. The crash only intensified Thunder's panic, and he wheeled around, looking for an escape that did not exist. Marcus made a decision that defied logic. Instead of staying safely pressed against the wall, he moved into Thunder's path. Not blocking him exactly, but making his presence known, standing in the middle of the barn with his arms slightly raised, not in threat but in a gesture of openness. Danny shouted something, probably telling him to get back, to get safe, but Marcus ignored his friend. He locked eyes with Thunder, and in that moment something passed between them. It was not trust, not yet, but perhaps a recognition. Two broken beings, trapped and terrified, both unsure of how to move forward, but knowing that the old ways of fighting and fleeing had not worked. Thunder stopped his frantic movement and stood trembling, sides heaving like bellows, sweat darkening his coat. Steam rose from his body in the cold November air. Marcus did not move, did not speak. He just stood there, maintaining that eye contact, letting Thunder see that he meant no harm. The seconds stretched into a full minute, then two. The only sounds were Thunder's labored breathing and the distant call of a nightbird somewhere outside. Slowly, so slowly that Marcus almost did not notice it happening, Thunder lowered his head, not in submission, but in exhaustion. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by a weariness that Marcus understood all too well. Taking a calculated risk, Marcus took one small step backward toward the open stall door. Thunder's head came up slightly, tracking the movement, but the horse did not bolt. Marcus took another step, then another, moving in a careful arc that would lead Thunder toward the stall without directly pressuring him. It was a delicate dance, one that required patience Marcus did not know he possessed. Each movement was slow and deliberate, telegraphing his intentions as clearly as possible. Thunder watched him with those intelligent eyes, and Marcus could almost see the horse thinking, weighing whether to trust this strange human even a fraction. The process took nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes of careful stepping, of maintaining non-threatening body language, of silently communicating through nothing but presence and patience. Danny stayed motionless against the barn wall, barely breathing, understanding that any interference now could shatter the fragile connection forming between man and horse. Finally, Thunder stood at the threshold of the stall. Marcus was inside, having backed all the way in, standing in the far corner to give the horse maximum space. For a long moment, Thunder remained outside, one hoof raised as if testing the ground, deciding whether to cross this final barrier. Then, with a suddenness that made Marcus's heart leap, Thunder stepped into the stall. Once inside, the horse immediately went to the far corner opposite Marcus, pressing his massive body against the wooden walls as if trying to melt through them. But he was inside, contained and relatively calm. Danny, moving with careful silence, swung the stall door closed and secured it with the heavy bolt. Marcus let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. His entire body sagged with exhaustion, the adrenaline that had sustained him through the past few hours suddenly draining away and leaving him hollow. He leaned against the stall wall, his bad leg throbbing from the strain of standing and moving for so long without rest. Danny appeared beside him, his face pale in the dim light, and for a moment, neither man spoke. They just stood there, listening to Thunder's ragged breathing from inside the stall, processing what had just happened. "That was the most insane thing I've ever seen you do," Danny finally said, "and that's including the time you ran across an open street under fire to pull Martinez out of that building." There was no anger in his voice, just a kind of exhausted wonder. Marcus managed a weak smile. "Yeah," he agreed. "Pretty stupid, but it worked." Danny shook his head slowly, running a hand through his hair. "This time, man. But Marcus, you gotta promise me you'll be careful. That horse is dangerous. One wrong move and he could kill you without even meaning to." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I know." They walked out of the barn together, leaving Thunder alone to explore his new surroundings, or simply stand in fearful stillness, whatever the horse needed. Outside, the November night had turned bitter cold, and their breath formed clouds in the air. Danny's truck idled nearby, headlights still on, illuminating the worn path to Marcus's trailer. The two men stood by the truck, neither quite ready to end the evening despite the late hour and the exhaustion that weighed on them both. "You sure you know what you're doing?" Danny asked, not for the first time. Marcus looked back at the barn, at the weak light spilling from the gaps in the old walls. "No," he admitted, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but I couldn't leave him there." Danny studied his friend's face for a long moment. "This is about more than just saving a horse, isn't it?" Marcus did not answer immediately. He thought about the moment at the auction when Thunder's eyes had met his, about the recognition he had felt of shared trauma and abandonment. "Maybe," he finally said, Maybe it's about proving that broken things can still be saved, even when everyone else has given up on them. Danny nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for further words. He had seen Marcus at his worst, during the months right after they came home, when Marcus could barely leave his apartment, when the nightmares were so bad that sleep became the enemy. If anyone understood the need for redemption, for proof that recovery was possible, it was Danny. "Look," Danny said, reaching into his truck and pulling out a business card. "This is a vet I know, specializes in large animals. She's good, patient with difficult cases. You're gonna need her, probably sooner rather than later. That horse needs a full checkup, shots, dental work, and those hooves are a disaster." Marcus took the card, feeling the weight of yet another expense he could not afford. Danny seemed to read his mind. "She does payment plans," he added, "and she's helped out veterans before. Just tell her I sent you." Marcus nodded, grateful beyond words. "Thank you," he said, and the simple phrase carried the weight of everything: the trailer, the help, the friendship that had persisted even when Marcus had tried to push everyone away. After Danny left, taillights disappearing down the long driveway, Marcus stood alone in the darkness. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional sound from the barn. He should go inside his trailer, try to get some sleep. Tomorrow would bring a whole new set of challenges, and he would need whatever rest he could manage. But his feet carried him back to the barn instead, drawn by a need to check on Thunder, to make sure the horse had not injured himself in the stall, to simply be present even if he could not offer much more than that. Inside, Marcus approached the stall quietly. Thunder stood in the same corner, still pressed against the wall, but the horse's eyes tracked Marcus's movement. There was less panic in that gaze now, replaced by watchful wariness. Marcus noticed that Thunder had not touched the hay or water, despite surely being hungry and thirsty after the ordeal. It would take time before the horse trusted even the most basic offerings. Marcus understood. During his worst periods, he had refused help too, suspicious of kindness because experience had taught him that nothing came without strings attached. "I'm going to tell you something," Marcus said softly, settling himself on an overturned bucket outside the stall, where Thunder could see him but not feel threatened. "I'm probably the worst person to be taking care of you. I can barely take care of myself most days. I've got problems in my head that don't go away, demons that wake me up at night, and a body that reminds me every day of things I'd rather forget." He paused, wondering why he was confessing all this to a horse that could not possibly understand. But somehow, speaking the words aloud to this damaged creature felt easier than saying them to another human who might judge or offer unwanted advice. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "I see myself in you. Everyone's given up on both of us. They look at you and see a dangerous animal that's not worth the trouble. They look at me and see a broken veteran who can't hold down a job or maintain relationships. But maybe we can prove them wrong. Maybe we can figure out how to heal together, even if it takes a long time." Thunder's ear flicked in his direction, the only acknowledgement that the horse was listening. Marcus settled more comfortably on the bucket, accepting that he would probably spend the next few hours here, keeping vigil through this first night. The November cold seeped through the gaps in the barn walls, and he pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself, wishing he had thought to grab a blanket from the trailer. The night passed slowly. Marcus dozed occasionally, jerking awake whenever Thunder moved or made a sound. Each time he woke, he checked to make sure the horse had not somehow injured himself or found a way to escape. But Thunder remained in his corner, standing in that same tense posture, refusing to lie down or relax even slightly. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the barn walls, Marcus finally allowed himself to believe they had made it through the first night. It was not much, but it was something. The following days established a pattern that became routine through sheer repetition. Marcus woke early each morning, his body protesting the cold and the hard surfaces he often slept on when he spent nights in the barn rather than returning to his trailer. He would approach Thunder's stall slowly, announcing his presence with soft words before coming into view. The horse always stood in the same corner, watching him with those wary eyes, muscles tense and ready for flight despite the impossibility of escape. Marcus would check the water bucket, which Thunder had finally started drinking from on the second day, and replace the hay that mostly went uneaten. The horse was dropping weight, and Marcus worried constantly about how thin Thunder was becoming. On the fourth day, Marcus used the card Danny had given him and called the veterinarian. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived in the afternoon, driving a truck equipped with everything she needed for large animal care. She was younger than Marcus had expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put him somewhat at ease. She listened as Marcus explained the situation, how he had bought Thunder at auction, the horse's wild behavior, his refusal to eat much or allow anyone near him. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully, asking questions about Thunder's background and what little Marcus knew of his history. "This is going to be challenging," she said honestly after they walked to the barn and she got her first look at Thunder. "He's severely underweight, those hooves need immediate attention, and his overall condition suggests years of neglect. But before we can do any of that, we need to earn at least a minimal amount of trust. Trying to force treatment now would traumatize him further and could result in injury to all of us." Marcus appreciated her straightforward assessment. She did not sugarcoat the reality or promise quick fixes. Instead, she outlined a gradual approach, starting with simply being present near Thunder, allowing him to become accustomed to her presence before attempting any physical contact or treatment. Dr. Chen visited 3 more times over the next week, each time spending hours simply sitting outside Thunder's stall, sometimes reading, sometimes just observing the horse in silence. Marcus joined her when he could, and they talked quietly about animal behavior, trauma responses, and the long road to rehabilitation. She shared stories of other difficult cases she had worked with, some that ended in success and others that did not. The honesty was refreshing. Marcus had grown tired of people who tried to paint everything in optimistic colors, who could not acknowledge that sometimes effort was not enough, that sometimes the damage was too deep to fully heal. But there were small victories. On day 10, Thunder took a piece of apple from Marcus's hand through the stall bars, the first time he had accepted food directly from a human. The moment was so unexpected that Marcus almost could not believe it was happening. His hand trembled as he held the apple slice flat on his palm, and when Thunder's soft lips brushed against his skin to take the fruit, Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth he had not experienced in years. It was just an apple slice, just a few seconds of contact, but it felt monumental. Dr. Chen smiled when Marcus excitedly told her about it during her next visit. "That's wonderful progress," she said. "It means he's starting to associate you with positive things, with food and safety rather than threat. We can build on that." Over the following days, Marcus spent hours hand-feeding Thunder small treats through the stall bars. Carrots, apple slices, sometimes just handfuls of grain. The horse began to anticipate these interactions, no longer pressing himself into the far corner when Marcus approached, but instead moving to the front of the stall, ears pricked forward with cautious interest. The breakthrough came on a gray morning 2 weeks after bringing Thunder home. Marcus entered the barn as usual, carrying his bucket of grain and apple slices. But this time, when he opened the stall door just wide enough to set the food bucket inside, Thunder did not retreat. Instead, the horse stepped forward, lowering his massive head to investigate what Marcus had brought. For the first time, Marcus was inside the stall with Thunder, sharing the same space with no barrier between them except mutual respect and the fragile trust they had been building. His heart hammered in his chest, very aware of how dangerous this could be. how one kick from those powerful legs could end his life. Marcus stood perfectly still, barely breathing as Thunder moved closer to the bucket. The horse's nostrils flared, taking in the scent of grain and apple, but his eyes never left Marcus. It was a test, Marcus realized. Thunder was evaluating whether this human could be trusted in close quarters, whether the vulnerability of eating while someone stood nearby was worth the risk. Marcus understood that feeling intimately. How many times had he avoided the VA cafeteria because eating around others made him feel exposed? How many meals had he skipped rather than face the discomfort of being watched, of lowering his guard even for the simple act of consuming food? The moment stretched impossibly long. Then Thunder lowered his head to the bucket and began to eat, still watching Marcus from the corner of his eye but accepting his presence. Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. He blinked them away, embarrassed by the surge of emotion over something so simple. But it was not simple, not really. This represented a fundamental shift in their relationship. Thunder was choosing to trust him, even just a little, even just enough to eat while he stood there. It was more trust than Marcus had earned from anyone in a long time. Very slowly, Marcus lowered himself to sit on the stall floor, making himself smaller and less threatening. His bad leg protested the movement, sending sharp pains up his thigh, but he ignored the discomfort. Thunder paused his eating momentarily, assessing this new development, then returned to the bucket with increased confidence. They stayed like that for nearly half an hour, Thunder eating and Marcus sitting in silence, both of them existing in the same space without conflict or fear. When the bucket was empty, Thunder lifted his head and, in a gesture that made Marcus's breath catch, took 2 steps closer and extended his nose toward him. Marcus remained frozen, not daring to move or even breathe too loudly. Thunder's muzzle came closer, whiskers twitching until the horse was close enough that Marcus could feel the warmth of his breath. Then, so gently it seemed impossible for such a massive creature, Thunder touched his nose to Marcus's shoulder. The contact lasted only seconds before the horse pulled back, but it was enough. It was a bridge, a connection, an acknowledgement that went beyond the simple transaction of food for tolerance. Marcus waited until Thunder moved away before he allowed himself to move, his muscles stiff from holding so still for so long. When he finally exited the stall and secured the door, Marcus had to lean against the barn wall to steady himself. The significance of what had just happened was almost overwhelming. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called Danny. "You're not going to believe this," Marcus said when his friend answered, and then he told him everything. Danny's response was characteristically practical, mixed with genuine happiness for his friend. "That's great, man. Really great. But remember, progress isn't always linear. Don't be discouraged if he goes back to being skittish. Trust takes time to build and seconds to break." Marcus knew his friend was right, but in that moment he allowed himself to simply feel the joy of the small victory. The following week brought new challenges that tested both Marcus's patience and Thunder's fragile trust. A winter storm rolled through, bringing freezing rain and howling winds that rattled the old barn's walls. The noise terrified Thunder, who reverted to his panicked state from those first days, throwing himself against the stall walls and screaming with fear. Marcus spent 2 sleepless nights in the barn, trying to calm the horse with his voice and presence. But Thunder was beyond reasoning, lost in a terror that no amount of gentle words could penetrate. By the time the storm passed, Thunder had several new injuries, cuts and bruises from his collision with the walls, and Marcus felt the crushing weight of failure settling over him. Dr. Chen came as soon as the roads were clear enough to drive. She examined Thunder's injuries, which thankfully were superficial despite looking dramatic, and then turned her attention to Marcus, who probably looked as bad as he felt. "You can't prevent every setback," she said gently as they stood outside the stall watching Thunder, who was exhausted but calmer now. Trauma recovery isn't a straight line upward. It's messy and complicated, and there will be days when it feels like you're back at square one. But look at him. He's letting us stand here. He's not in the corner. That's progress, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. Marcus wanted to believe her, but the exhaustion and disappointment made it hard to see anything positive. He had been foolish to think he could fix Thunder, to think that kindness and patience would be enough to overcome years of neglect and abuse. "What if I can't do this?" Marcus asked quietly, the question escaping before he could stop it. "What if I'm not enough?" Dr. Chen was silent for a moment, considering her words carefully. Then she turned to face him directly, her expression serious but not unkind. "Marcus, do you know what I see when I look at Thunder now versus 3 weeks ago? I see a horse who's gained weight, whose coat has more shine, who doesn't automatically assume every human wants to hurt him. I see a horse who touches your shoulder with his nose, who eats while you're in the stall with him. Those things would have been impossible 3 weeks ago. You're doing better than you think. Maybe the question isn't whether you're enough. Maybe it's whether you can give yourself the same patience and grace you've been giving him." Her words hit harder than Marcus expected. He had been so focused on Thunder's healing that he had not noticed his own gradual changes. The nightmares that usually plagued him had lessened in frequency. He was sleeping better, probably from the physical exhaustion of caring for Thunder, but also from having a purpose that got him out of bed each morning. The anxiety that typically kept him isolated had eased somewhat, replaced by the immediate needs of another living being that depended on him. He was not healed, not by any stretch, but perhaps he was less broken than he had been a month ago. Over the next few weeks, winter settled in with earnest cold. Marcus used what little money he had left to buy proper horse blankets, thick and warm, to protect Thunder from the bitter temperatures. The first time he tried to put a blanket on Thunder, the process took nearly 2 hours of patient coaxing, but eventually the horse accepted the strange garment, seeming to understand that it provided comfort rather than restraint. Marcus also managed to convince Thunder to allow basic grooming, running a soft brush over the gray coat that was finally starting to show signs of health. The act of grooming became a meditation for both of them, quiet time where Marcus could check Thunder's body for any new injuries or problems while the horse stood calmly, sometimes even lowering his head in relaxation. Danny visited regularly, often bringing supplies that Marcus could not afford, hay and grain and medical supplies, always presenting them casually as if they were extras he had lying around rather than deliberate acts of charity that Marcus's pride would have forced him to refuse. On one visit, Danny brought his teenage daughter Emma, who had expressed interest in learning about horses. Marcus was hesitant, worried that Thunder might react badly to a new person, especially after the setback during the storm. But Emma approached with the kind of fearless gentleness that only young people who have not yet learned to be afraid seem to possess. She stood outside Thunder's stall and talked to him about everything and nothing, her chatter filling the barn with a lightness that had been absent. She told Thunder about her school, her friends, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian like Dr. Chen. Thunder listened, ears forward, and after a while, he moved closer to the stall door, interested in this new human voice. Marcus watched in amazement as Emma extended her hand slowly, and Thunder, after a moment's consideration, allowed her to touch his nose. It was a moment of grace that reminded Marcus that healing was not just about overcoming trauma, but also about learning to open up to new possibilities, new connections. Christmas came and went quietly. Marcus had no family nearby, no traditions to maintain, but on Christmas morning he sat in the barn with Thunder and shared an apple, cutting it into pieces and feeding half to the horse while eating the rest himself. It was a simple moment, but it felt sacred somehow, a quiet celebration of survival and the bond they had formed. Thunder had become more than just a horse to Marcus. He was a companion, a reason to keep going, a mirror that reflected back Marcus's own capacity for healing if only he could extend to himself the same compassion he had shown this damaged animal. In early January, Marcus woke in his trailer feeling worse than usual. His chest felt tight, and a persistent pain radiated down his left arm. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to sleeping wrong or maybe having strained something while working with Thunder. But as he made his way to the barn for morning feeding, the pain intensified. His vision blurred at the edges and sweat broke out on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. He made it to Thunder's stall and managed to pour grain into the bucket before the world tilted sideways. The last thing Marcus remembered before darkness claimed him was Thunder's alarmed whinny and the sound of his own body hitting the barn floor. When Marcus regained consciousness, he had no idea how much time had passed. His first awareness was of pain, sharp and insistent in his chest. His second awareness was of Thunder, standing over him, the horse's massive head lowered, warm breath on his face. Thunder was making soft, worried sounds, something between a nicker and a whimper, sounds Marcus had never heard from him before. Marcus tried to move, but his body would not cooperate. The pain in his chest had spread, becoming a crushing weight that made breathing difficult. He understood with terrible clarity what was happening. This was a heart attack, and he was alone in a barn with no way to call for help. His phone was in his trailer, useless to him now. Fear washed over him, not so much of dying, but of what would happen to Thunder. Who would care for the horse? Who would have the patience to continue the slow work of healing they had started together? Thunder pawed at the ground near Marcus's head, agitated and distressed. The horse had somehow opened the stall door, something Marcus would have thought impossible, but desperation created its own kind of intelligence. Thunder circled him once, then twice, whinnying loudly as if calling for help that would not come. Marcus wanted to tell him it was okay, that Thunder should not worry about a broken human who had foolishly thought he could save anyone when he could not even save himself. But the words would not form, his throat too tight, his breath too shallow. Then Thunder did something extraordinary. The horse moved to stand directly over Marcus, positioning his massive body as a shield against the cold wind that cut through the barn's gaps. Thunder lowered himself carefully, an incredible feat for such a large animal in a confined space, until he was lying beside Marcus, his bulk providing warmth and shelter. The horse pressed close, sharing his body heat, and continued making those soft, distressed sounds. It was an act of pure compassion, an attempt to comfort and protect the human who had shown him kindness when the rest of the world had shown only cruelty. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, whether from pain or emotion he could not tell. Here was this animal, who had every reason to fear and hate humans, choosing instead to offer what help he could to a dying man. The irony was not lost on Marcus. He had spent 3 months trying to save Thunder, and now Thunder was trying to save him, even though there was nothing the horse could realistically do. It was enough, though, knowing he would not die alone, that his last moments would be spent with this creature who had become so important to him. Time became strange, stretching and contracting in ways that made no sense. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, always aware of Thunder's presence, the weight and warmth of him a constant comfort. At some point he heard new sounds, human voices shouting, the crunch of footsteps running across frozen ground. Danny's face appeared above him, pale and frightened, and Marcus realized that his friend must have come for his regular morning visit. "Thank God," Danny was saying, over and over. "Thank God I came early today." The paramedics arrived with efficient speed, their hands gentle but urgent as they assessed Marcus and prepared him for transport. They marveled at Thunder, who had moved aside when the humans entered, but remained close, watching everything with anxious eyes. One of the paramedics commented that the horse's body heat had probably kept Marcus from going into shock, that Thunder had quite possibly saved his life by keeping him warm. As they lifted Marcus onto the stretcher, he reached out toward Thunder, wanting one last touch. One last connection. Thunder stretched his neck and pressed his soft nose into Marcus's palm. The gesture so tender, it broke something open in Marcus's chest that had nothing to do with his failing heart. The days that followed were a blur of hospital rooms, tests, medications, and doctors explaining that Marcus had suffered a significant heart attack. He would need surgery, lifestyle changes, ongoing care. But he was alive, and the prognosis was good if he followed medical advice. Danny visited every day, bringing news of Thunder. The horse was restless, Danny reported, spending hours standing at the stall door looking toward the driveway, clearly waiting for Marcus to return. Emma had been helping with feeding and care, and Dr. Chen had checked on him, but Thunder would barely eat, would not allow anyone clothes the way he had allowed Marcus. 3 weeks after his heart attack, Marcus was finally released from the hospital with a bag full of prescriptions and strict orders to rest. Danny drove him home, parking carefully near the trailer. Marcus insisted on going to the barn first, before even entering his trailer, despite Danny's protests that he should rest. His body was weak, his movements slow and painful, but he needed to see Thunder, needed to assure himself that the horse was okay. As they approached the barn, Thunder's head appeared over the stall door. The horse saw Marcus and began nickering frantically, a sound of pure joy and relief. Marcus made his way to the stall, his steps unsteady but determined. When he reached the door, Thunder pressed his face against the bars, and Marcus wrapped his arms around that massive head, holding on as tears flowed freely. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here, Thunder. I'm not going anywhere." Behind him, Danny wiped at his own eyes and quietly took a photo on his phone, capturing the moment when two broken souls, having saved each other in ways that mattered more than either could fully express, were finally reunited. The months that followed brought changes to both Marcus and Thunder. Marcus's recovery was slow but steady, marked by regular doctor visits and cardiac rehabilitation. Thunder continued to heal as well, his trust expanding gradually to include a small circle of carefully chosen people. They were not fixed, either of them. Marcus still had nightmares sometimes, still struggled with anxiety and depression. Thunder still startled at loud noises, still bore the psychological scars of his early neglect. For they faced each day together, finding strength in their bond and purpose in their shared journey toward healing. Marcus had learned that saving Thunder had also meant saving himself, that in choosing to see worth in a creature everyone else had abandoned, he had begun to see worth in his own damaged existence. And Thunder, who had lived his life believing humans meant only pain, had discovered that trust was possible, that gentleness existed, and that love could be found even in the darkest places. Together they had proven that broken things could heal, that nobody was beyond redemption, and that sometimes the act of saving another was the very thing that saved yourself.